Gigadon and Adejnakaz. Okay, Nadona Sing Donjabog, Ganoje Dodem. I've been asked to speak specifically about being a newer generation that didn't have to attend residential schools. So that's where the conversation will go with me at the very least. And in my family, I'm the first one that was not forced to go to a day school, not go to a residential school. I do have other relatives who are younger than me who did have to go in different places. And I missed, I'll say I missed the day school, but I went to a school that was converted from a day school to a First Nation ran school. I was there 3 years after that transition happened. And, I don't know any different, but I know I know this, and this is the common theme I think you're going to see across the table here is when we have healthy people, we can do amazing things. And I'm pretty humble. We all are, and I still feel those effects, just like I think everyone does. Like I know even my kids feel the effects of residential school. It's definitely multi-generational. And like for myself, growing up in multiple places and left Chiging First Nation, where my last experience was as a child living on reserve. My family moved up to a place called Chapleau, which is not far. It's actually... we're pretty close to it now compared to being to Manitoulin, to Chiging. It's further to Chiging than it is to Chapleau. So they moved up there because they were tired of the seasonal work. And what I say next, you'll all understand, I'm sure, is back then in the 80s, there was a lot of building of band homes. And then there in the winter, there was a lot of people on Pogie. You guys remember Pogie? Yeah. Okay, and that's still a thing around, right? In different names now. But that was our life. Then they changed our life, and they moved myself and my brother up to Chapleau because they could work year round. And back then in the 80s, number one jobs in Chapleau were basically in the sawmills. And in the sawmills, there was actually 3 of them up there. I ended up working in one eventually. I'll tell you, the best job I ever had was working in a sawmill after I left Lakehead and quit hockey up there and moved home at Christmas my second year. Best thing that ever happened to me was my parents said, hey, by the way, Monday you're going to work in the sawmill. And I don't know if they arranged it, but they had me doing the worst job probably in Chapleau. Okay, I was doing basement cleanup and the ceilings were they felt like they were 6 feet high. That was it. So hunched over trying to shovel sawdust. Well, that made me go back to school. I'll tell you that. And I went back to school. That's a tough lesson. Go to school, go to work, or go out on your own, right? That's kind of where I came from. But, we can do some positive things. We've all got our traumas. But with me, that going back to school and staying in school, then going on to York University really paid its dividends in the long run. I don't have a master's or a PhD or anything like that. I was a part-time professor at one point there, but I'm not anymore. Got relieved of those duties, mostly because I wanted to go do other stuff. But why I'm telling you all of this is the reason why I moved back to what I call home, which is to me Manitoulin Island, is I went back for a summer, left my dad's forestry company and tree planting and all that stuff, and went back to go do an office job at a place called the Wabatek Business Development Corporation as a business development intern. So I'd studied business, and I was going to York to study, or I was at York studying political science with goals to go to Osgoode Hall and become a lawyer. And that didn't play out, which 20 years later, I'm okay with that because I'm probably doing some great things. And greater things than I would do as a lawyer, I would say. But with that being said, that summer that I worked back home in our communities, it was so rewarding because we were able to create opportunities through business for our own people so they didn't have to move away from their homes. They could stay in their home community and generate jobs for themselves, generate an income for themselves, and it was fantastic work. So when fall came and I was supposed to go back to York University, they offered me a business development officer job, and I jumped at it, and I left York and I stayed on Manitoulin, and it was probably one of the best decisions of my life because I was with my people. I was at home, I was in my territory, and I was able to get connected to the land and do a whole bunch of different things. One of the greatest things that came out of that was I got introduced to Indigenous tourism in 2003, and it's quite funny from my perspective now, as I'm one of the older ones in the industry from Indigenous tourism. Arguably one of the best at developing Indigenous tourism in the world, literally. Been all over the world talking about things, talking about how to do tourism, and it's a lot of fun. And the first thing that they ever sent me on 20 years ago was they sent me to the world's largest trade fair. It's called the International Tourism Bourse. So it's ITB. So if you're in the tourism industry, you know what I'm talking about, but it's phenomenal. There's over 200 countries represented there. Canada is just a small little piece of what goes on there. I think there's like 14 or 17 exhibit areas that 10 or 11 of them are like the size of football fields. So there's a massive amount of people there. It's quite phenomenal. But that was my first introduction to how to support Indigenous tourism. And it's really quite fun. But, I learned a lot over those years. And what we did in tourism was we focused on four main things. We focused first on cultural authenticity. Then we did marketing and branding. Then we did product development, and workforce development is the next thing, because we got labor shortages, and Indigenous people are still the fastest growing population in Canada. Okay, so I'm trying to do my small part, and you can do your small part by simply being a little bit healthier, right? And we didn't have all those traumas that were shared up here before. We have some, don't get me wrong, and there's still residue, but the healthier we are, the more we can contribute to the community. And when I say community, yes, there's multiple levels. For those non-Indigenous people that are here, there's community, like that's, our First Nation community. There's our, the actual First Nation itself. Okay, there's different levels of community. And when I refer to community on many fronts, I think of the people. It's all of us. We're all part of the same community. And, the idea of the me world, I don't align with it, and I really struggle with it. When everything's focused solely on money, it's a hard thing to swallow for me. Don't get me wrong, I know money makes the world go round, and I'm in business. I get that. Personally, I'm going through a lot of challenges with being a student of capitalism and what I'm doing now. There's things that we have to challenge, I think, and modify and evolve, but that'll come in time. And it's so much easier to do when you don't have extra baggage, right? Extra luggage that you're carrying around. And, for myself, I know I spend a lot of attention on myself to help heal a lot of different things that have happened to me as well. I've gone through some stuff that, I'd probably rather not share, that it's pretty traumatic over time. And some of that stuff you can find online, because I'm open about it in certain circles. But with that being said, when we're healthy, we can do good things. And if we're putting each other, beside each other with and putting each other ahead of ourselves, sometimes we're going to do good things for everybody. And with that, I know I've said I was going to go on for 5 minutes. I'm probably at 15 now, but I know we want to have some time for questions there. So I'm going to pass it over to my friend here, I believe, or am I handing it back over here? You can pass it down if you want. Okay, perfect. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll just want us to end with this. I'm an open book, okay, and 15 minutes isn't a long time. I usually talk for 3-4 hours, okay? But with that being said, I'm an open book. Come and ask me anything, track me down. The only thing I'm going to ask of you is be persistent, because there's a lot of people tracking me down to ask me things and run things by me. So I'll leave it at that. Naha miigwech.
All right. Anin, Stacy Minoa, Asamaji Kwe Indigenous Cause, Getaganzi Bean Don Juba, Nam and Dam. So my name is Stacy Solomon. Around the Mountain Lady is my spirit name. I'm from Garden River, and I'm part of the Sturgeon clan. 5 years ago, I wouldn't be able to say that sentence in the language. I can't say much, but I'm learning on that, because I'm reclaiming all of that. So when I was asked to speak today, it was just kind of what my experience was. being a child of a survivor, and how that sort of impacted me, and being the first generation in my family that didn't have to go to residential schools. My dad was had to go to Shingwauk, just right across the road there. He was a student there. He didn't talk about it a lot, so we didn't. I didn't. I knew I was Native. I knew I was Indigenous growing up, but we didn't know the language. We didn't know like the culture or traditions. We knew we lived on the reserve, and that was it, because we went to a Catholic grade school, public high school, and it's my dad. He, like you said, it was because of what he went through there. He didn't talk about it a lot, and we didn't know about it. So as I got older, I decided to reclaim that for myself, for him, and for my family. That's what I did when I went back to school at Algoma. We lost my dad in 2014. So that was when kind of my journey with all of the reclamation started for me. Because we had talked about it, him and I, before, that we were going to start learning the language and some of the ceremonies and the teachings together. And we never got that chance, him and I. So I took that on for me after we lost him. And I had to go back to school. I knew I had to get the education, because that's how we teach our younger generation. We have to know what the real history that went down, how things were. So I went back to school in 2016 for social work at the college. And I was just going to do 2 years. That was going to be it. But the more I went there, I was like, I got to keep going, because he always said that I was the brains of the family and I was going to do things he couldn't. So that made me feel like that was the catalyst for me going back and going to Algoma specifically, because I wanted to take back that space for my family. So when I did, I graduated this past spring for like the honors Bachelor of Social Work, and took back that space for him, for myself, for my family. And it was like the proudest day of my life. Walking across that stage, I could see him being excited. He wasn't like a very educated man, but he was like the smartest guy I knew. And I don't know what it was in him that made him the way he was, because he could have been, he could have gone down so many the roads that a lot of our people did because of the traumas at residential school. He could have been alcoholic, could have had substance abuse issues, and been all those things. But there was something in that man that he never allowed that to happen. And I asked him one time why that was, and he just said, I'm raising you guys completely opposite of what I was. So he did everything that, like, opposite of what happened to him. And for me, that, like, I'm here because he survived that, right? I think we all are. Everybody is. And spaces like this, days like this, our younger generation needs that, because we were asked, there's a teacher asked how I say nicely what this day meant, or say it in a good way. And the reality is there's no nice way to say it. What happened to my father, our ancestors, our relatives, there was nothing nice about it. There's no sugarcoating that. So you have to be honest, and days like this, panels like this, allow that to happen, I think. And the more we educate ourselves, we can have those discussions with people that want to have them in an honest, open way. Because like for so long in my life, because I didn't grow up with any of this knowledge, and even the real history, because I was taught what we were taught in schools. And it was, that little blurb in that history book that was on a page that just called us savages. And what we did, that was it. So it wasn't until I was 31 that I started to reclaim all this and know all of our teachings and our ceremonies. And now I'm passing it on to my nieces and my nephews and my brothers, and even my mom and my aunts, and when they want to have the discussion with me. So I think for me, that's what this day and Truth and Reconciliation is about, is having those tough discussions, because they're going to be tough. And this culture, this language, it's healing. It's everyone can get something out of it when they know, and that's what it is to me. I'm proud to be like a descendant of a survivor. I know the traumas he went through, but he never let that, dictate his life and be his only thing. And myself and my brothers we're the product of that. And that's why I'm grateful, like, for days like this. There's a word in the language I'm not gonna try because I'm gonna butcher it, but the meaning is it's the ties or strings that bind us generationally. And I learned about that from a teacher of mine, and when we were talking about how every Indigenous person that you see is either a survivor or a child, a grandchild of a residential school student, like every single Indigenous person. And the language, when the word is just, it's probably about 11 letters, but the meaning is so impactful. And that's what I love about our language, that they're not just letters thrown together. There's so much meaning behind every single word, and the resilience that language had to keep doing this, like to keep being here this long after everything happened. Yeah, I think it's pretty incredible, and I was honored today to ask to come and speak on that, and I think that's my experience.
So I'm just going to admit that I am not experienced enough to go off script with this. This is my first time speaking, so I was very nervous. So I am going to read, and I apologize for that. And just for a little bit of context, I am the daughter of Melford Bunny Fisher, but he was a Mount Elgin Indian Day School survivor as well, and someone that struggled with a lot of trauma and addiction and being in the correctional system as a youth and adult. So I come with that context. So, Ani, Bojo, Gitchiwaban, and Nagikwe, and Indigenous cause, Ashley Fisher, Shaganoshi Nozwin, Wawashkashin and Dodam, Deshkan Zibi Nindonjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe Nindao, Bawating, Nindonjano Kitige. My spirit name is Great Morning Star Woman, and my English name is Ashley Fisher. I am Deer Clan, and I'm from Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, which is just southwest of London, Ontario. And I'm an Anishinaabe woman, and I've been working in the Bawating area since about December 2018. Before I do briefly speak, I do want to acknowledge all the community elders that have gathered here, the sacred medicines that are here on the space, the drum, as well as each and every survivor that is here today. I also want to acknowledge Chief Dean Sayers. And with that, we come here representing Northern Region Community Correctional Services, which is within the Ministry of Solicitor General. And we began a multi-year partnership with Shingwauk in early spring of this year to establish the very first traditional medicine garden that would directly support the development of culturally relevant healing supports and interventions for Indigenous folks under community supervision. So I'm talking about those that are on probation, conditional sentence, or often called house arrest, or bound by a parole certificate, a provincial parole certificate, all in an effort to improve outcomes and slow down or even stop the revolving door of corrections that too many find themselves in these days. So unfortunately, many of us today here know all too well that the reason that they find themselves caught up in these cycles and why we are so overrepresented in the system is a direct result of our colonial histories. The policies, the traumas, the intergenerational impacts, and the things that have brought us here today, the things that have been discussed here today, as well as the fact that despite all of the progress that has been taking place, there remains such a disconnection from culture and traditional ways for so many generations, so many communities, but for so many correctional clients. These fractures and this disconnection has left so many struggling to find answers, struggling to know who they are, struggling to live that healthy and balanced life that Kevin was talking about, that good life, Minoba Modswin. And often this is the case for Indigenous folks that are caught up in the system. And this is where we as a new unit, also the first of its kind in the province, saw a need to do better and an opportunity to try something different from a ministry perspective and not from an Indigenous perspective, because we know what works. So we looked around at what was needed to be our first steps to move the region in a better direction, and we had no medicines to work with. So we had nothing to support clients. We had nothing to support programming, nothing to support community healing spaces and relationship development, support services, and nothing to ensure protocol for interacting with elders and community leadership in a good way. And so that's where we needed to start at the beginning. And that brought us here to Shingwauk. And after meeting with Diane and touring the space and visioning the potential of the grounds with her and chatting about the medicines and what they could do for a lot of people throughout the northern region, we knew this was a great location to really plant those seeds for change. Many people here today know the value, the benefits, and the healing that can come from picking up those medicines for the first time, especially for an adult that has never had that exposure, never had those experiences, those connections, and those teachings. Or even for those that are reconnecting after a long break or a hiatus for whatever reason they had. And luckily, this was something that I was able to see firsthand when I was working in London, doing frontline supervision work down there, and it's really stuck with me ever since. I really think by alleviating barriers to traditional medicines, including access, we begin supporting clients and reclaiming a piece of their identities whenever and wherever they are ready to take that step. And by doing so, we hope that this will open up those pathways to healing for more and more people. We also know that in order to do things in a good way, elders and community must lead that work, these teaching moments, as well as the development of any cultural resources. And this is something that we have ensured with Shingwauk in that partnership. So with SKG staff and elders and community leading the way, our hope is that all that love, all that connection, all those thoughts of healing go into the medicines and then out to those searching and in most need. And in turn, the garden also supports the Indigenous Studies curriculum and the students here, as well as the surrounding communities and their learning needs and pathways as well. I also believe that there's potential for intergenerational healing with what is being created here. So I keep having this daydream, perhaps of a client or perhaps even a domestic violence client and their partner and their co-parent sitting down at a kitchen table with their children, clicking on a virtual link from a laptop or a cell or a tablet that opens up to elders and students and community, welcoming them and teaching them how to smudge, how to hold themselves in ceremony, and how to ground themselves when they are struggling or in need of spiritual support, all within the safety of their own home or their own spaces. I've also heard so many good news stories already from Diane and the garden staff, Joanne and Lisa, about how the community and the students of all ages and backgrounds, which I've seen today, are already gravitating to this beautiful space, a space where folks can come and connect, learn, and get that hands-on experience and knowledge of those medicines. And it's experiences and community spaces such as this that really support the rebuilding of cultural identity and pride, and directly support that resurgence that we see happening with traditional healing knowledge and pathways, while also providing a space for non-Indigenous to come and increase their understanding of those colonial things that happened, those traditional ways, and the importance of reconciliation. Additionally, our hope is that the garden will continue to expand, which the ladies have also said numerous times this morning. And they're going to continue to diversify, and we'll begin supporting some of the next steps we have planned as a region, all things that will further reconciliation. So one of those things is going to be the establishment of a regional elders advisory council. So that regional council will provide advice, counsel, and recommendations on all things impacting Indigenous correctional clients throughout the North. The council will also provide spiritual and cultural support and guidance on how the region can incorporate, embed, integrate, but harmonize with Indigenous services, cultural supports, and healing pathways. And I'm just going to make a quick plug here. If there are any elders here today that feel a calling towards Indigenous justice and healing issues and working to improve outcomes for those in custody and on community supervision, so those on probation, or if you know of other elders that are in the northern region, so we're talking Barrie, Simcoe area north, that we should be reaching out to over the next few months, please see myself or consider talking to Mr. Clayton Ralph. I think he's around here somewhere. If you can wave in the back there, because we're collecting those names over the next little bit. And our hope is that by establishing a regional elders council, we can continue learning by listening and then by aligning the necessary supports and resources to put that direction and guidance into action. Hopefully carving out a model and a new roadmap forward for other regions to pick up. At the end of the day, we know that the ministry has not been getting it right when it comes to working with Indigenous correctional clients and their unique healing and wellness needs. But I hope that this garden, as well as the pending Elder Advisory Council, signals some hope, some positive change, and that the region and the ministry are moving in the direction of reconciliation. What was taken must be replaced, one small piece at a time, one healing pathway at a time, and one individual at a time. And with that, I'm going to cut myself off and say chi miigwech to Diane for inviting me to speak and share space with you all today, and her continued support and vision, as well as the garden staff, Joanne and Lisa, and all the community members, elders, and students that have played a significant role in getting this garden up to where it is today. Miigwech.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jay Jones. Both my parents were sent to Shingwauk Indian Residential School. My mom was taken at 4.5 years of age from her front yard along with her brother. And when she arrived here, she had an older brother that was already here that she never knew. Even though they lived in the same building, maybe 100 feet away from each other, she never got to meet that brother that was already here. And she was much too young to remember him when he was taken. So that happened just across the street. And then I have, like I said, both my mom and dad were sent here, taken here forcibly, and 3 uncles, 1 on my dad's side and 2 on my mom's side. My one uncle, whom I never knew and whom my mom never knew, even though they were brother and sister and lived in the same building, died here at Shingwauk. He's now buried in the Shingwauk Cemetery. I'm part of the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. It's called the CSAA. The CSAA has been together for almost 40 years. It's a grassroots group made up of survivors. They've been doing this healing work for 40 years. So my mom kind of tricked me. She said, "Will you drive me up to Sioux? I have a meeting." I goes, "All right, I'll go." So I bring my kayak or my mountain bike, and while she's doing her thing, I'm doing my thing. And then I kept coming up there. She kept asking me to drive her. So finally I said, "Okay, what are you doing today?" And she told me, I goes, "Can I be a part of it?" And it was a CSAA meeting. And I kind of want to learn what they were doing because I knew it was important work. So I attended the meeting, and I became somewhat involved. I helped out a lot at the Shingwauk gatherings, reunions from 1996. I've been involved with those. And then probably about 11 years ago, I really got involved. I joined the group, and I was active in doing things on all the things that they do. And they do so much work. It's amazing. For now, they're all in their 70s and 80s. My mom and both my dad are gone now. They've left. And when you think about it as an intergenerational survivor, and if you're Indigenous and you're under this tent right now, you're a survivor. You're an intergenerational survivor. One of my most favorite terms is first generation out. Just like the others have said, I'm the first generation that was not forced to go to day school or the 60 scoop or residential school. Shingwauk closed in 1970. That's in most of our lifetimes. So when you think about the impact it has on us as people and our siblings, and you learn about it. I didn't learn about it. I'm 62 now, and I didn't learn about my parents' residential school story until I was in almost mid-40s. So it's amazing when you think about things like that story has not been told. So when you have a chance to sit down with survivors, with your elders, and there's some in every community because it's affected. There's over 170 Indian residential schools in all of Canada. Just Shingwauk alone, over 120 communities were affected by Shingwauk Indian Residential School. And we've narrowed it down to 84 active communities. So when you think about that number and you think about, say, just me, 1 person, 2 parents, 5 siblings, they have children. So my mom and dad, when they passed away, they were great-grandpa. So when you think about the residential school effect and how it keeps going down the family lines, it affects many people. Now think of it, over 150,000 children were sent to these residential schools. And you think about all the families that are affected after that, all the intergenerational effects. And the number is staggering. So I always like to tell those numbers and those facts and stuff because that gives people a sense of how it really affected us. If we don't know some of those things, my mom has heard, and I've heard that, oh, get over it. Well, you can't get over it because it's multiple generations being affected by the abuse. And the abuse on so many levels, and we all know what that is. But one of the most terrible things was no parental nurturing. Now think of multiple generations that don't know how to be parents. You know, think about the mom and the dad that their child falls down and they don't really know how to console them because they were never taught. They never experienced that. So it's up to us. It's up to this next generation that can turn that tide. They can break the cycle. And we have to, and I started talking about sitting down with the elders. Working with CSAA has just been a gift. I mean, I've volunteered hundreds and hundreds of hours to that. And Nellie's a CSAA member. She's from Chapleau, I believe, Chapleau, right? Yep. And Nellie's part of CSAA. And you sit down with these elders and your heart just grows. You listen to their stories and how resilient you are. We go to a CSAA meeting and we're laughing. The first 10 or 15 minutes, we're laughing and just having a good old time. And when you think about, our CSAA meetings are inside Shingwauk Hall. So when you think about put it in context, these are survivors of this residential school sitting in the very rooms that they were maybe abused or hit or called stupid Indian, and they're there laughing. They choose to laugh. And that's why it's so nice to work with these survivors. They have chosen to make something good out of something bad. And that was their motto at the very beginning of this. And I think we all have that choice. We just have to get the gumption to do so. We have to make that choice. And working with CSAA, they've been on their healing journey. And Barb Nolan in the previous panel, she talked about your healing journey never stops. It's always moving forward. And there might be someone here today that heard them earlier or hear us today. Their healing journey might start today. So you have to be very cognizant of those things, that everybody's on a different path. Everybody will view it just a little bit differently than what you do. And I hate saying this, but sometimes you have to be accepting. You don't have to agree with them or the way they do it, but you have to be accepting because we're all in a different place at a different time. But I think the healing part is the most important part. And I've been fortunate enough to spend all that time with the CSA elders and learn from them. And so I was president, and we're going to fast forward to like last year when Kamloops broke open. We had a sharing circle with CSAA elders, and we were supposed to have a regular meeting. I was president of CSAA, and we were supposed to have a regular meeting. I said, let's just have a sharing circle because, you could tell there was a heaviness on everyone's hearts. So every elder spoke, and every elder ended with, we have to do the search here at Shingwauk. And one of the most particular things of that sharing circle was Marjorie Lee. The first thing she said is, now maybe they'll believe us. Because these stories, I've heard these stories firsthand. They're 70 and 80 years old, these stories. They've been here for older than what we are. And they're true, but they were never believed. They were so outlandish, these stories weren't believed by many people. And so now Kamloops breaks open. All of a sudden they have proof. Those stories are true. So we have to do something about it. And that's why we're here. As intergenerational survivors, we can break that cycle. We have it at our means. We're in a different spot than they are. We don't have the firsthand trauma that they had, but we still experience some of that. But we have the tools at our hand to change that cycle. And I've been a big proponent of doing that and breaking the cycle. And for me personally, CSAA has really helped me on my healing journey. And just like today, I talked to GM of Canada. I gave a presentation to GM of Canada earlier today. And there was over 200 people on that Zoom meeting. So I bet you my last dollar, more than half of them have never heard a true story of an Indian residential school survivor or intergenerational survivor. So we're educating them. Any chance you get, and just like when you sat down, it's like, I've never done this before. It's like, all right, rock on. We're going to do this, you know? And it starts there. It starts there. And then once you get comfortable with it, then you start telling the story. Because the more people that learn that story, the more people that are informed. And then the more people that know the truth, then we can finally reconcile. You have to know the truth before you can reconcile. And one component that doesn't get much talk about in the truth and reconciliation aspect is forgiveness. We have to forgive people. We have to. If we don't forgive them, then we will never, ever reconcile. We won't have the tools inside our heart and inside our mind to reconcile. If we can't reconcile, then we can't move forward in the best way possible. So when I think about all these things and the large undertaking that we all have, and my personal story was leading the search for unmarked burials here at Shingwauk. After Kamloops, they asked me to lead the search. Of course, I said yes. I was compelled. There was no way I was going to say no. I didn't know the enormity of that task. So I'm a designer at General Motors, just outside of Detroit. So my typical work week is 40 to 50 hours at least, bare minimum. And then I was doing this work on it. So I was working 70 to 80 hours a week, my GM work and this work. And it got to the point where, my friend always sends me a picture of a candle burning at both ends. And that's what I was doing, burning that candle at both ends. But Ozma, AU president, said, she goes, can you take a leave of absence from GM? And I goes, I think I can. I'll check into it. And my managers were gracious enough to allow it. And GM was gracious enough to allow me to move up here and concentrate on this work. It was heavy. It was very heavy. A lot more heavier than I anticipated. But I learned a lot. I learned so much. And that was part of my healing journey. So I lived up here during the winter. But what I realized, I had this epiphany about 3 or 4 months into it. And I was up here for 6 months total. I said, I left my family. I left my job that I love. I left my friends. I left my home. I left my church. I left everything that I know that comforts me, that warms my heart. I left it to move to a foreign country, and Canada is foreign compared to the U.S., and I'm here all alone, and I didn't have a support system, and it started weighing heavy on me. And then I experienced lateral violence. And I never knew what that term was until I was here. And someone says, you're experiencing lateral violence. And I goes, I am? What is it? So I looked it up, I Googled it. And I goes, yeah, that's exactly what I am. So and the reason I tell you this story is because I think that's the biggest thing that is stopping Indigenous people of moving forward. We have to put our differences aside, no matter what they are. We have to forgive each other, no matter what it is. Because at this point in time of history, Canada's receptive. I've seen more change with the Canadian government in the last year than I have the last 21 years being involved with CSAA. And I have meetings with Canadian government, Ontario government, and you can see their receptiveness. We started a meeting, and they're ready to talk about funding. I says, we need to stop. I stopped the meeting. 2 words come out of the woman that was chairing the meeting. I says, we need to stop and recognize why we're here. We're here for the children that never made it home. And I told a little bit about my story. And you could just see the room calm right down. And then we had our spiritual advisor there. Nadine, it was your brother James. And James sang a song and drummed. And after I said what I said and James did his thing, the whole room, which was, we were in Smallland, but you could just see the whole Zoom meeting just come down. Everybody's tone changed. So when we're all moving forward with the same goal in mind, with the same full heart, then we can get many things accomplished. And I'm here to say I've seen a lot of changes in the last year, and they're good changes. But it's up to us to forgive and move forward and just simply love on each other. That's what we have to do. If we can't, then I don't really, this road will be a little longer than it needs to be. But this is our opportunity. And survivors, I want to acknowledge all the survivors and what they've done for us and the stories that they tell. I got to enjoy Barb Nolan's talk, and I was just, I love hearing the survivors. And if make it a habit of, getting with your survivors and listening. Just like they were talking about Shirley Roach, and she was like an auntie to me. Every time we had meetings, she'd come and hug me and just we would talk and stuff. And she was good friends with my mom, Susie Jones. My mom, Susie Jones, was very instrumental in getting this building built. She was on Shingwauk Education Trust Board, and she was president. And she was very instrumental in that. So the other panelists talked about learning the language and all. I've never learned my language. My mom would be the first one to say you're truly assimilated. And that's not bad, because you still have something to offer. Even though you don't drum or sing or dance or have regalia or know your language, there's still something for you to offer. You don't have to feel guilty for not knowing knowing those things. So, Chimagwech for listening, and Chimagwech for all you guys.
Miigwech to everyone for sharing. It's an honor sharing this table with all of you and be able to share along with you. So let's start with Miigwech there. So, Bojo, Nigana Nabe Indigenous Cause, Wawan Don Jaba, Midashki on Dadizia, and the Wede. Michipakotin, Mage, Michipakodong is in the Kade, Ishkonaгаning, Wenjabayan, Ojibwe Nishnabe, and Dao, Midashkaya, Wemtigoj, and Dao, Upjin, Miigwech Wenda, Mayayan, Yoman, Ongom, Miigwech Kinoomaage Gamig, Oman, Ongom, Miigwech Wendam, Jawabaminanan, Kinoomaage. So hello, my name's John Paul Chelikoff. I am born and raised in Wawa. Spent my childhood there. Member of Michipikan First Nation. Spent my childhood in Wawa. My teen and formative years here in Sault Ste. Marie, Milmabawating. And then went away to Thunder Bay for a few years, and then went back to Wawa and. Been in Lansing for the last 3 years, and then just moved back this past summer. So really, really happy to be back, and happy to see everybody here today. And so I'm just gonna, jump right into it a little bit, share a little bit of stories and how I've come to understand my own family stories and history regarding residential schools and intergenerational effects and trauma, and hopefully again I appreciate Jay sharing a lot of the pieces on if you don't know, there's nothing wrong with that. I didn't understand a lot of things till my teen years, and still learning every time. And every time you listen to a survivor, you'll learn and hear something new as well. And just so many of those stories are inspiring when you get a chance to sit down and take Jay's advice, and whenever there's a survivor around, take that opportunity to sit down and learn from them. There's so many stories of inspiration and strength and overcoming, and I think my favorite stories are just those little stories of what they were doing on a day to occupy themselves. I worked at the 2012 residential school survivor gathering, and I remember walking through the hallways, and a survivor came by and just started telling stories about walking and playing in the bush in the back across the road, and sometimes he said the Jaganash kids would come and throw rocks, and there was this one that was really good at climbing the trees, and he'd do the Tarzan scream and swing across the trees and scare the Jaganash Ibanojiak away there that were throwing rocks at them. And I was like, wow, like that was such a good story. So yeah, like if you get the chance, like really make use of that. They're so kind and they're sharing, and as you know, they're such tough history and tough stories, but they're survivors are so kind in their willingness to share and help us all grow and advance from that. So I'm going to move on to, I guess, like my own family history. So my some of the pieces are a little different than other stories. Again, similar to what Jay was saying, everyone's kind of got a different story, and it doesn't always kind of fit into larger narrative sometimes. But I think it's important to know we each have individual stories, and try to understand all those different individual pieces there. So I'll try to help navigate how I navigated that over the years and had to figure out some of that, because there's nothing in like books or guides on how to really navigate this, right? We're all trying to figure this out as best as we can, and we try to do it in a good way as best as we can. So my grandmother, Frances Beaupre, née Tangi, born Michippicotten, part of the inland group. So that's north of Wawa and there's a coastal group. So Michippicon's made of a coastal and inland group. Came to learn that later in life as well. The Dajin Opaming and Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe that lived in the bush in the north kind of thing, was our family lineage. The French described us as the tête de boule, or the roundhead. So when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's where this came from there. I remember talking to Dean Sayers about that once, and he said that anthropologists are able to identify Ojibwe compared to like Lakota or Siouan peoples because our skulls are a little bit bigger there. I remember him saying. But so my grandma's story is a little bit different. I started learning about residential schools when I was in high school. I guess that was between 2000 and 2005 kind of thing. My mother would bring me to the Shingwauk residential school survivor gatherings and reunions. And I want to say, if you have the chance, bring your children to these events. Like, I didn't fully understand everything that I was hearing or being exposed to at that time, but I was able to connect back to those memories later in life. So like, even if your children don't understand, and again, like, this is heavy stuff, but even if they don't understand the experiences they'll get, like those things carry forward. And I one of the things that stood out to me this morning was just these gatherings can be heavy, but they're also like the laughter this morning, the warmth. I just feel inspired by the people that we're surrounded by, and every time I attend these gatherings, I don't leave feeling heavy. I feel inspired because the survivors are leading that way, like that. They've gone through traumatic things, and yet they show us how to move forward with heads held high and keep pushing forward, that we can't stay stuck. We have to constantly work towards what we're striving towards. And my grandmother is an inspiration in that way too. So I'll move into her story a bit. So for my grandma, it took me a little while to understand the full effects of how things work. So my grandma, Frances, had a tough childhood at home. She only spent 1 year at the Shingwauk Residential School in 1954, and she described it almost more as a break than away from home. So when I first heard that as a teenager, I had to understand what did that mean. Because the stories is a little bit different than what I was hearing or understanding. So it took me a few years to learn to understand and navigate that. And then the more that I'd listened to her stories about what was happening at home, the more I was realizing the intergenerational effects of what was happening, the way that she was being treated at home, everything that my grandma was speaking about, you could see and hear. Those were behaviors that were learned at the school. So my grandmother herself was an intergenerational survivor of trauma. All those behaviors and patterns of what she was hit for and punished for, and the expectations that a 5-year-old shouldn't be on her knees scraping and cleaning the floor kind of thing. Those were behaviors that other family had learned from those schools, right? And that had carried forward. And then so all these different pieces, there's again, nothing that's really there to, there isn't a 10-step process how to walk through this, right? We all have to gather these stories and experiences and figure that out on our own. And that's part of what I had to navigate through. So I share that, hoping that, again, the family stories and the histories might not always match up with, but each individual story and family history, it's important to know and understand if you have that opportunity to learn that. And it's not always available, right? A lot would keep these stories close, understandably. That lineage was in our family. Like my great grandfather also went to St. John's residential school in Chapleau, and some of those stories were traumatic, and they'd come out in times of vulnerability. And you know that when a man is in his 70s crying about being thrown into a scathing bathtub during his childhood, and this was before a lot of this was out in the open, right? That these stories, they carry these with them throughout their life, and a lot of that older generation didn't have a place to heal from and release a lot of this, as a lot of the Shingwauk alumni have been able to do since the 1980s. It's such an amazing thing, the work that's been done by the Shingwauk alumni that have been coming to these gatherings and learning to heal and share and release their trauma to move forward there. So I grew up afraid of my grandmother. She was, when you watch TV as a kid, our grandmas were always the sweet ones, right? That giving the cookies, and but I was more afraid of again, not super mean, nothing super big, but she was able to say something and it would be like a dart in you, right? And yeah, don't mess with grandma there. And if you got grandma mad, and grandpa would be, hey. So you didn't mess with grandma. And I think that was a good thing too, in a way. You definitely maintain that respect of elders, but I was afraid of her growing up. And then as I started learning more of these things, I think my grandma went through healing as she got older as well. And the last years of, the last 5-10 years, I was no longer afraid of her. And I think she grew, learned how to, she often shared her stories for those that were, she'd sing, and then sometimes she'd have little story interludes between her songs sometimes, or if you'd sit down with her, she'd share her stories, and I think and then she learned how a lot of the things affected her as well, right, from these kinds of sessions and education, that it's important for everybody to be able to learn and to heal from that, right? So in her last years, I feel like we got closer, and I understood her better, and I understood why things were a certain way, and I understood more of the family dynamic and that. And I think everyone's doing the best they can to heal and continue forward in a good way. But so I guess I want to kind of tie this into what I'm kind of been doing with my own life and work, and how my own grandma's life, she gave us a solid foundation. She did the best she could. Her and my grandpa did the best they could for the children, my mom and aunts and uncles, and they did the best with what they could and what they had, and I try to honor that with the work that I do. So my mom's a big inspiration in this as well. So my grandmother grew up speaking Anishinaabe. She spoke until she was about 5 years old, when her grandmother used to speak to her, and then once her grandmother passed away, they no longer really spoke to her, the community. And I think that's a familiar story for many, right? That a lot of the older generation wanted to protect the younger ones, not learning the language because you could be punished for it or held back, right? Whether it be at the school or at society. So my grandmother lost it. She lost her fluency as no one spoke to her, and forever mourned it. But she also did work throughout the years of learning it. She'd go to classes and attended Algoma U classes and Anishinaabe. And my mother also took that inspiration. My earliest memories of Anishinaabe from like a clear sense of like, we grew up with little words like tudush or dodosh, instead of like nipple or that. So little words carried forward, right? But I didn't realize that was Ojibwe or that we used little words like that. So in '97, Professor Howard Webb-Cummagood and Elder Joe McWanabe, and both from Manitoulin, and I think Joe was living in Michigan at that time, and Sam Senecal from Batchewana came to do a week-long language workshop at Michipicoten in 1997, and my mother brought myself and my two sisters out, and that was like the first real exposure to Anishinaabe, and lit a flame in my mother where she really wanted to learn it. And in time we wound up moving to the Sioux, and then my mother enrolled in the Anishinaabe program at Algoma University. And that line of my mom and aunts and uncles, they were all first generation post-secondary students, right? So my mom helped, and then aunts and uncles all provided a strong example. So I had no idea what I wanted to do in high school, but Anishinaabe sounded cool and seemed like a good thing to do. So I kind of followed my mom's path, and Howard Webb-Cummagood was also my professor. So I met him as a child in '97, and he went on to become one of my foundational language teachers today there. So I work in language revitalization. I do my best to learn. Still a learner. I've made some progress, but still have so much more to learn. And one of the ways I try to do that is to weave language, music, and education. And one of the nice ways to do that is to write and record new and original songs. So I've been trying to do that. I slowed down a little bit in recent years, but working to get back into that. So this all comes back to, I guess, a final memory to kind of tie this all back together. All these little pieces. I said I was afraid of my grandmother, right? And over time, I grew to not be afraid, but I was still shy about showing her my songs. Like anyone that heard her sing, she had, I think she could have really been a star had she not, had she been able to go to a bigger city, and she could have been a country singer. I really think that when I hear recordings of her, and so like my grandmother for me was like a musical giant, and she'd bring her guitar everywhere, and my grandpa would tune it up, and she'd just bust the guitar out and sing anywhere. So she was a musical giant to me, and I was scared to show her any of my song. I only had one at the time. Her final years, she was developing and going through dementia. And the last time I had a visit with her before she kind of went into sort of coma, she was, my Aunt Louise and cousin Brianna were visiting her in the hospital, and I stopped in. And then, sometimes the dementia patient, they start to get hyper or agitated, right? And my grandma was starting to get to that point, and usually as the sun starts setting, right, something about that time usually triggers a dementia patient. And I had that little song on my phone, and I figure this is the moment to show her. So I started playing it. It's this little song about the colors of the animals. So it started coming out. Makwa makadeweze, makwa makadeweze, anin enanzad makwa. Makwa makadeweze, makwa makadeweze. So just a simple little song. The bear is black. What color is the bear? The bear is black. So I played this to her, and as soon as like the guitar started ringing out, her composure changed, and her hands started bouncing to the rhythm of the song, and I saw her face look up in shock almost when she realized I was singing in Ojibwe, and I remember her going like, "You're singing in the language," and the song kept playing, and then she's like, "You speak better than I do now," and I let the song play, and it was just it was one of those moments I wish I had shown her sooner, that I had sat down and played and written with her. But I was glad that I had that moment, share that song with her, and I try to carry her musical spirit and inspiration in the work that I do, and that's what I hope to keep doing, is working in language. I hope to making materials for children. I went through the French school system. I still remember songs in kindergarten that I haven't heard since, like Pomme de renette, pomme d'api, petit tapis rouge, pomme de renette, pomme d'api, petit tapis gris, and it's like, I haven't heard that since kindergarten, but I still remember that song, right? So part of my hopes is to just make these little songs and earworms that kids could learn in Anishinaabe and carry forward with them throughout life as well, and just hope to keep trying to do things in a good way. And I acknowledge all the work that of all the elders and all the community members and my family and the survivors of the foundation that they've provided for us. And I try to honor all of that in the work that I do and that we do. And with that, I'll just say miigwech. So, mio.
Anin bojo, denawe magani duk, zongi gabawi kwe, nin deshanakaz, maingan indodem, obajo nang, ishkunagan nin donjiba, hanishanabe ikwe indao. I want to apologize, first of all. I'm late. I was over at Algoma. I was invited to speak on a panel as well over there, and they kind of got me first before SKG, but I was very happy to be that I could come and be a participant on our panel today. I sit as a board member with SKG, and and along with everybody else, I really feel connected there. It is Chief Shingwauk's vision and dream for our people to get educated in such institutions. I want to say that I am a direct descendant as well to Chief Shingwauk. He was my mother's great-great-grandfather. My mom, Hilda Pine Iban, was a Pine back then, and her mother was hailed from Bay Mills. She was an Anishinaabe Kwe from Bay Mills. Her name was Martha Kay. At the time, though, back before that, she was Martha Kegekons, which means little hawk. But then the Indian agents at the time could not spell or say that name, so they just tagged her with Martha Kay. I'm happy to be here, titled under Reconciliation, the Next Generation Discussion Panel. I'm happy to be a part of that. My English name is Kathy Surratt. I am presently the Executive Director of the Indigenous Friendship Center here. And as I said, I sit on many boards, including SKG. So I guess I'm to share my story a little bit about being a first-generation person to a residential school survivor. To sum it up in short sentence, it was not easy. So my mother and her three sisters were taken from Kitaganzi B, Garden River, from their home. She was 5 years old, and her older sisters were either 7 or 8 or 6 and 7. My other 2 aunties. And they were taken from the home in Garden River. Their dad, my grandfather, Charles Pine, at the time as well spoke Ojibwe to my mom and my 2 aunties. And when they were taken over here to Shingwauk Residential School, they were forbidden to speak their language that they grew up with, that they were growing up with, and but yet they couldn't understand English. And the late and great Lee Miracle, if anybody knows who I mean, who I'm speaking about, referred to that as crippled two-tongue. And when we think about that, you know, we can't speak our own language, and yet we don't understand English. We can't speak English either. So that in itself was a form of generational abuse. One story that my mom spoke about, just one, she didn't speak too much about her time at residential school here, but she did share some stuff. When they got to the school, it had been months since the sisters have seen themselves, my mom and my auntie Doris and my auntie Gladys. It had been a few months since they've seen each other, and they were having breakfast in the hall. She referred to as the hall. And as the children were coming in single file, my auntie Doris seen my mom, and they were so happy to see each other, and my auntie automatically started to speak Ojibwe. And she was taken out of the line, and it got back to my mom that she was kicked down the stairwell and her head was banging. And since then, you know, she was never the same. We had to help her with her with her grocery shopping, with her business deals, her banking. You know, she couldn't speak very well since then. My auntie Gladys, some of you may remember her. She drank herself to death. From what I know now, from what I understand, as just burying all that hurt and abuse that they suffered here at the residential school. I sat on a panel with George Diamond and Mackenzie Jacobs over at Algoma just earlier this afternoon. That's why I'm late. So I met George Diamond, and I had asked him, are you any relative to, was it Eddie Diamond? And he says, well, I'm his brother. And I said, oh, okay, it's nice to meet you. And he says, Kathy Surrett. He says, do you know Jerome? Did you know a Jerome? I said, yes, that's my father, that's my dad. And he says, oh my God. And he shared some really good stories about him and my dad having good times. And he says he was a really good dancer. And so that warmed my heart, and it automatically, I felt that connection with George. It was really a pleasure to be sitting beside him. As I said earlier, my experience as a child to a residential school survivor, put it in short, it was not easy. As we all know and understand, our residential school people were not brought up with people who knew how to parent. Therefore, when my mom and dad met each other and had all these kids, we were under that rule still of residential school. My mother was the disciplinarian. We didn't do things right. Well, she put that on us just to keep things nice and smooth and short and simple, like me. Today, when we think about residential schools, we think of like every single Indigenous person is either a survivor, is the child of a survivor's grandchild, or all three. Every single Indigenous person. That remains true today. My childhood, I must say, from the time of birth to 11 and 12 years old, I think everybody knows the term an adult child. And that was me. I was an adult child. I didn't know why my parents left me where they did. I was at that time, my dad was an alcoholic. My mom drank some, but she mostly went out to watch him. And it's heartbreaking because I have a young nephew in the audience, and perhaps he did not hear those stories, my childhood. But I over the years, I've gotten my healing, and I can sit here and speak about that today. And like I said, from 1 to 11, I was an adult child, basically raising myself. Remember the old nurse McNamara would come around to the reserves and give us those inoculations, those booster shots. Well, I got mine, and my arm got so badly infected, and I was about 5 or 6 years old, that it swelled right up. And I remember being at my grandma's, because that's where my mom and dad would always leave me. I remember being there, and I took 2 fingers and I pressed on that, and the infection comes spurting out onto the floor. I remember taking my Auntie Mammy's, and God knows if she would have known I'd done that, I probably would have got a whipping. But I took a clean pillowcase and I wrapped it. Nobody was there to take care of that. And when we look at our own children of 6 and 7 years old, they could never survive that today. So I was a child who had to fend for myself. I was left, like I said, at my grandma's quite a bit. I didn't know why. I think when I look back today, my mother thought I probably was safer there, although I wasn't. So, a long story short, from 1 to 11 years old, and maybe 12, going into the age of 12, in hindsight now, I feel I was one of the more fortunate Indigenous people. My mom and dad decided to quit the alcohol. They decided that that's not the life that they want. 'Cause there were times when I woke up from my parents and people were coming over and partying all night and drinking and smoking, and I would wake up and this lady would be sitting on a chair in the kitchen, and that was my mom, beaten beyond recognition. I didn't know who she was. And that happened several times. So finally, finally something happened. Something great happened, that they left the alcoholism. And they moved on to a life in search of culture, a sober life. And I tell you, that is one of the best things that they've ever given us. You talk about, you get all these fancy gifts and so on and so forth. Well, my parents gave me the gift of their sobriety. Finally. And I have long forgiven them, because when I put myself in survivors' shoes, it's not their fault. It's not their fault that they were put here at those schools. It's not their fault that they were abused. It's not their fault that they didn't get their healing, because back then we didn't know what healing was. Even when I was married, I didn't know what healing and counseling was until something happened. So like I said, I feel like I am one of the more fortunate Indigenous people today, because my parents did sober up. Even though, from 1 to 11 or 12, I've seen things that children should not see, and I've experienced things that children should not experience. But today I don't want to dwell there because I have gotten some healing. And every day, somebody had said a little bit earlier on the panel that every day is healing, and that's so true. Every day is healing. I learn something new every day. I don't want to sit back in that childhood, in that where that little girl was. I've moved on from that, and I have long forgiven my parents for what they put us through. When my dad had so many years of sobriety under his belt, he called us into the bedroom one day, one by one. I'm not sure that all of us went in, but the older ones, he certainly did. And he said, "You need to forgive me. I'm sorry for what I put your mama through." How healing is that? I have seen a man who I despised as a child did a 360-degree turnabout with his life, and I can say he's the second greatest man that ever walked the earth today. As I had said, my mom was the disciplinarian when I was a little girl, and I understand that, and I've forgiven that. There's at least one sibling older that still has a hard time with forgiveness. And I said, you have to really, really look into that, because I've put my feet into mom's shoes, and I don't even know if I could survive what she had survived being a residential school survivor. I was with my mom one time and I was with Auntie Shirley Roach, and they considered that they were sisters. They were not blood sisters, but by the same token, and their experiences that they've had, they considered each other a sister. So she is my auntie. She was my auntie, Shirley Iban. And back before Pino's, it was IGA, and I still call it IGA. I don't know if anybody else does, but we were in there, and my mom was doing some shopping, and Auntie Shirley was doing her stuff, and I'm just a little girl tagging along, and my mom had seen this man down at the aisle in a wheelchair, and she started to sweat. She started to shake. She went up to that man, and she said, "I know who you are. I know who you are." She said, "My name is Hilda Pine. I'll never forget what you done to me at Shingwauk Residential School. I will never forget that." And he just brushed it off and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." But I seen my mom sweat, shake, anger, furious. And over the time, in their sobriety, in their sober lives, Mom, of course, like every other residential school person, survivor, never could say, "I love you," never could hug us. And I thought, you know what? The heck with this. This is my mom. I'm going to give her a hug, and I'm going to tell her, "I love you, Mama." So I remember the first time when I did that, she was all like, she couldn't hug me back. But I said, "Mom, you're not going to get away with this." I thought that in my mind. You're not going to get away with this. You're going to hug me back because I'm going to keep hugging you. I thought that. And it's what we've done, me, my sisters, and not so much the brothers. You know how guys are, but we kept hugging her. We kept hugging her until she hugged us back, and she felt safe enough to hug us back. And she felt safe enough to say, "I love you too." And we thought, yes, we're breaking this. We're breaking a cycle in our lives. Just amazing. It's just amazing. But today, like I said, I am super grateful for the sober life that my mom and dad lived. Even though, like I said, from 1 to 12, I was a damaged child. But I've forgiven. When you heal, you forgive. Yes, it's heavy. Somebody talked about that heaviness. but it's healing. And we use a lot of humor, for our own healing. Anishinaabe are the funniest people that I know, and not everybody can get our humor. So with that, my friends, I think I'm going to end this. I want to thank you, Diane, very much, and SKG for inviting me to sit on your panel and to share, a little bit of my life as a first-generation person to a residential school survivor. Miigwech.
Once again, folks, let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Nimigwecha Wainem, Nigani Kinoomaage Gamig Bijaye Gamioma Nongom, Shingwauk Kinoomaage Widi Gamigonge Join Jagade, Gapachkomi Gwech, Gikadua de Nongom. Thank you for all that you have said. Thank you for sharing. And I'm reminded of two things. Firstly, I've said this earlier, and as we see the work that's unfolding, when we talk about this day of truth and reconciliation, and for survivors, it's what we know as Orange Shirt Day. We are the answer to our ancestors' prayers. Each one of our panelists that sit here are all doing amazing work. They've all sharing their own personal story and connection and how we're all affected by this. That's what we talk about when it's intergenerational. And the other part is I see strength and resilience in each and every one of our panelists and leadership, because we have to remember where this day came from. When the national apology was made back in 2008, that was the largest litigation suit in Canadian history. And that's not an Indigenous practice. That's a practice in Canadian law, where plaintiffs have a right to compensation for those who've committed crimes against them. That's not an Aboriginal practice. That's a practice that's standard in Canadian law. And what happened is when the survivors took this to court and they were awarded compensation, it was the largest case in Canadian history. And in turn, what survivors did in the spirit of friendship, in the spirit of education, in the spirit of reconciliation, is they set up a national foundation. And from all of those efforts, we have a day, a national day for truth and reconciliation. And within our panelists, we see strength, we see resiliency, we see perseverance, and we see an unstoppable force of people who are continuing in the work, and you are the answer to your ancestors' prayers. Miigwech Bijayeg, thank you for being here.